Welcome to the KM059 Buzz.
Hello, this is Gary here, and this is episode 59 of our Beekeeping podcast. And this week we have a special guest, Mr. Cliff Van Eaton, all the way from Te Puke. And this is the KM059 Buzz, where beekeepers from the hills of the Waitaki Ranges in West Auckland. And our podcast is about beekeeping, gardening, and political issues sometimes. And we also interview people from around the world. And often we go off on tangents when we're talking about stuff. So it's all good, but it's all about beekeeping, and we're here to share what we learn. So we hope you enjoy it. And the show notes for this podcast are KM059.nz/59 or /Cliff. Yeah, it's been funny weather this week in New Zealand or in Auckland, and we've both been pretty sick with a stomach bug. And I've also torn all the tendons in my hand, so that's not good for making stuff either. Yeah, just some notes about the contest. If you want to enter the contest, please send those responses to contest@kiwimana.co.nz. That's contest, CONTEST, at kiwimana.co.nz. And that contest will close on the 25th of November 2014. And it is open to everyone in the world, so don't worry about that. We will post out the free copy of the book to whoever wins, and that will be announced on episode 60 of our podcast, which is probably about the beginning of December it'll come out. So get involved in the contest. So keep your pen and paper handy when the question comes along. Anyway, so let's get into the podcast. So Cliff Van Eaton is an agricultural consultant and author. He was born in America actually, but he learnt his beekeeping in Canada. But he's lived in New Zealand for over half his life. He's the author of the new book, The Manuka, the Biography of an Extraordinary Honey, and also the co-author of the original AFB Without the Use of Drugs and the Control of Varroa Mites. He co-wrote those with Dr. Mark Goodwin. Hi, Cliff. And
hi, how are you going there?
Good. We've given the KM059 audience a little overview, but take it from here and tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, well, these days I guess I'm sort of a semi-retired, really. I definitely, as you say, I was actually born in the United States, but learned my beekeeping in Canada.
Oh, okay.
And then came over here, as you say, about half a life ago, I suppose, to New Zealand. Got involved with the beekeeping industry here. Worked as an advisory officer to beekeepers for a number of years, and then did consultancy work as well. Got involved with the Varroa outbreak that we had in 2000 here in New Zealand, and more recently got involved with my wife in a business, garden center business, and that. And we finally sold that. I decided to have a go just doing some writing, but doing writing differently than what I did when I was, an advisor and that, a consultant. I wanted to try to write some books about bees and beekeeping that everybody, the general public, might be interested in, rather than writing specialist books for beekeepers on subjects like disease control and that sort of thing. And so the outcome of that is this book on Manuka, the Biography of an Extraordinary Honey. And you don't come across the biography of a substance very often, but that's what we've got here. Yeah.
Well,
that's really what it is. Yeah, a biography to tell the story, this rags to riches story of how Manuka went from a honey that beekeepers couldn't give away in this country to now becoming arguably the most famous honey in the world, and certainly the most expensive honey in the world. And there's a great story behind that you can tell, and everybody can be interested in that.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. I've almost finished it, so it's really good. I mean, there's even stories about the beekeeping industry in the Great Barrier Island, and they were saying apparently they pour some of it into the sea, or it's allegedly.
Well, that's right. That's a story that I call it apocryphal. You use that word when you can't be sure whether it was true or not.
Yeah.
A good mate of mine definitely heard that story when he was living on Great Barrier Island. And Great Barrier Island, for those people, not from New Zealand, it's sitting right at the front of Hauraki Gulf. It protects the harbor. It's a fantastic bush area and a great place to go and visit if you ever, do come to New Zealand. And it was one of the first places that actually had commercial beekeeping in the country, which was a really amazing thing, eh? But it became quite famous for their honey, and their Manuka honey. But then, things changed for the beekeeping industry, and it got to be difficult to actually sell that honey. The honey was being sold overseas through a marketing board, a controlled marketing system for exports. And they found it was really easy to sell the clover honey because it was, honey that everybody knew around the world. But some of our honeys from New Zealand, they were quite unique. And it didn't fit into the sort of the commodity market, so they had a really hard time selling it. So on the barrier, this guy produced this crop of Manuka honey just after the war. He basically came back from the war, found all these hives that had been abandoned because most of the men on the barrier went off to Second World War. So he sort of resurrected the hives, produced a crop, extracted it, and of course Manuka honey is fixotropic. Only two honeys in the world are like that, Manuka and heather, and it's hard to get out of the combs. So he actually had to cut the combs out of the frames, put them into the equivalent of a cheese press the honey out. So it was a really, really hard job. But he got the honey out, put it into 60-pound tins, took it off to the wharf, was waiting for the ferry, and he got word of the price he was going to be getting from the marketing board for the honey, which wasn't going to hardly cover the costs of shipping it just across to Auckland. So he frog marched these 60-pound tins to the edge of the wharf and dropped them into the into the water. He deep fixed them.
Oh, if only we could get those drums now.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we were just talking about that earlier this morning, and they probably have, of course, rotted with the salt in the sea. But yeah, it would be like discovering a Davy Jones locker or a treasure trove now, wouldn't it?
It would be. Yeah, and the funny thing about, not funny, but Peter Molan, he was the guy that sort of did this research originally, and his original paper was rejected by the New Zealand Journal of Agriculture Research, which is, do you think they lacked a bit of foresight there?
Well, that's the thing, and I've been giving these presentations around the country about the book, and one of the things is that, science is often about serendipity, and you come across things that you thought you knew, but turns out that everything's quite different. And this is a classic case of that. It was more a matter of sort of the establishment, science establishment, having sort of written off honey in many, many respects. And he did this work. There it was. It showed that there was a special antibacterial property, one that was different from the hydrogen peroxide you find in all other honeys. But, of course, the science establishment here, at least here in this country, looked at it and thought, well, I think the quote that Peter gave me was, "This was of no interest to anybody." Well, yeah, it only took just a very short period of time after that to becoming quite interesting to a whole lot of people, and he started getting a lot of interest from a lot of science journals, particularly overseas, and carried on with that work. And yeah, we really owe him beekeepers in New Zealand certainly owe him a great debt of gratitude, because he was the one that discovered this special property. And the cool story about it, you talk about serendipity and almost luck. Well, they only did that test on 3 samples of honey. And they did it. He wasn't a honey researcher. He was a biochemist. He was a lecturer at the University of Waikato. He just happened to have a friend who had some hives. And over the summer holidays, they just decided to test a few honeys and just plate them out on, petri dishes, just the standard bacterial test or antibacterial test. And 2 of the samples were from this guy's own hives. One was clover and the other one was buttercup. And then they had this one other sample that a mate had given him, and it turned out it was Manuka honey. And when they did the test, and particularly when they knocked out the hydrogen peroxide, which they knew would be present in all honeys, you could read about that in pretty well any beekeeping book, they found this really strange thing. The one sample, this Manuka honey, still had this amazing antibacterial activity. And of course, what Peter then had to do was follow, as I say, his own edict. I talk about in the book, following his own edict that he always told his students when they came to him with an unexpected result, and that was do the test again. So he did the test over and over again with a whole lot more samples of Manuka honey, and then that's how he established that there was something in this honey that basically no one had ever found in a honey before. It's an amazing thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing. So, and that's why you've dedicated the book to him as well. Is that right? That's
right. Yeah, and the world becoming aware of this and the developments of the honey and people learning about its antibacterial activity, its therapeutic activities, the fact that it became a leading wound care dressing, all that totally changed the face of beekeeping in New Zealand. So beekeepers, instead of having to, give their honey away literally, they were getting fantastic sales for it, and it's just really changed the industry. As I said in my dedication, he's had a greater effect really on the beekeeping industry than anybody else, save the very first person that brought bees to New Zealand in 1839. And the amazing thing about it, of course, is he was an immigrant to the country, and he wasn't a beekeeper. In fact, he wasn't even a honey specialist. He told me, when he first did these tests, he didn't know anything about honey. But he was just totally blown away by it, and it became, as he said, a wonderful adventure for him for his life in then studying it, because it was just so out there, so different from what they expected.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, that's one thing about your book that I really love, is that it's kind of like an historical account of honey, and especially honey in New Zealand. So, you've got the story.
Yeah, it is. I try to put the whole thing into context, and you've got to tell some of these other bits to the story to explain things like how come beekeepers had to give their honey away. If you don't actually talk a little bit about the history of beekeeping in New Zealand, and particularly the honey marketing in New Zealand, well, that actually doesn't make sense. But when you do tell the story, well, it does make perfect sense, and it's a classic case of decommoditizing an agricultural product, wasn't it? And it just shows it was the power when you do that, when you take a product which everybody thought they knew, and they just really produced as much as they could, and you just hoped you got a decent price for it, to actually trying to identify what was special in that honey and making a much more valuable product. It's amazing what you can do with agricultural products.
Yeah, I found it amazing that in your book that about the honey board used to mix different honeys together to kind of make a bland honey, which is
That's
really,
right. Yeah. Well, they get honeys from different sources, and of course, we did have a predominance once, pasture agriculture really developed in New Zealand, a predominance of clover honey for the country, because clover was, in the pasture, and it was what really gave the impetus to the development of pasture agriculture here in New Zealand with our sheep and beef and dairy and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
When the clover's there, it produces, this light-colored and honey with a subtle taste to it. You can take some other types of honeys that are light and you can blend it. But we had in New Zealand, along with this clover honey, which is probably the most widely produced honey in the world, we had some floral sources that were found nowhere else in the world. Okay, the New Zealand native species, particularly various trees. So we had some these native trees, like rata is one of them, that New Zealanders certainly know. It produces a very light-colored honey, and of course they couldn't find a sale specifically for rata honey overseas because nobody would have known about it.
Yeah.
But they could take that and they could blend it with the clover, and in so doing, they were able to sell more of the honey as a clover blend. With some of the darker honeys, that became more problematic. There wasn't really so much of an interest as a commodity with the darker honeys, but they would blend various honeys, including Manuka, and sell them for, they used to call them industrial uses, things for baking and, use to put in as an ingredient in foods and that sort of thing. So that's what was happening there.
Yeah, exactly. Because I know that old beekeepers used to use Manuka honey just for feeding the bees, didn't they?
Well, that's right. I mean, as I say, literally giving it away. The Ministry of Agriculture actually, after the Second World War, and I chronicle this in the book, they were actually providing advice to beekeepers to, first of all, try to keep your bees away from areas that produced Manuka honey, where the Manuka was blooming. And if you couldn't do that for some reason, then, finding some way of trying to deal with the honey, they looked for some uses to hopefully sell it, and they actually worked out a way to change the honey to the point where they could just sell it as glucose syrup. But mostly what they suggested that beekeepers do is keep the Manuka honey that unfortunately they might have produced, keep it behind as feed honey for their hives, okay? Sometimes, though, beekeepers would end up producing so much Manuka honey that was more than they could even use for their own hives, okay, as feed. Yeah. And there you had a situation where they'd call up mates, sort of lived, down the road somewhere, and say, oh, I've got more Manuka honey than I need in these combs. Would you mind taking a bit of it off their hands? And they would actually do a swap. And this is amazing, that they would swap frames full of Manuka honey for empty frames with the beekeepers. So the beekeeper they swap with, he would have use the honey for feed as well. And all the other beekeeper would expect in return was just empty frames.
Yeah, and
That's pretty amazing, isn't it?
Oh, it's amazing now. I bet those guys are shocked to hear that people are actually planting Manuka trees, to get to Manuka honey now, eh?
There's a big program underway. First of all, for breeding and identifying the strains or varieties of Manuka plants that produce the highest level activity through its nectar. And I said not all Manuka honey is created equal. Some of it has a much higher activity than others. So first of all, identifying which of the varieties are the ones that have highest activity. And a guy named Dr. Jonathan Stevens at Auckland University is the one who identified these different strains. Then once you get the different strains, then you make cuttings from these things and use them to create plantations. And there's work underway to create a number of plantations of Manuka to actually increase the amount that we have growing here in the country. It's the most widely spread native plant in New Zealand. But obviously, given the prices that we're getting for the honey, it's nowhere near enough. And it's very much a New Zealand thing. There's a little bit of it that grows on the eastern seaboard of Australia and in Tasmania, but then that's it. So it's very much, a New Zealand-centered plant and New Zealand-centered honey, a unique, really, honey to hear.
Yeah.
And so if you want to get more of the honey, what you've got to do you've got to turn some marginal farmland and the hills and slopes and that you've got to actually plant it out into Manuka to get more. And that's an amazing turnabout as well. I mean, you read the book, you can see how everybody's talking about it as an infernal weed. And there was a time not so long ago that farmers were actually paid subsidies by the government to actually get rid of it and destroy this part of the New Zealand bush to be able to turn the resulting land into pasture.
Well, yeah.
So now we've gone and we've just done the reverse. Now all of a sudden particularly a lot of this land that was originally they cut out and destroyed the Manuka, that land, these sort of big high slopes and stuff in the central North Island, and that's now being planted out again with Manuka. So Manuka's day has come again as a plant.
Exactly. No, it's a great thing. I know people used to, even when I was growing up, they used to use it like firewood a lot of times,
Well, and they still do.
They
and
still
of course, as you know, here in New Zealand, Manuka chips are used for smoking fish and meats and that sort of thing. And there's plentiful uses for Manuka as a plant. And as I say, it is really the most widely spread of the New Zealand native plants throughout the country.
Yeah, absolutely.
It loves New Zealand, and it grows from the tip of the North Island all the way to the bottom of the South Island, and really quite enjoys growing on the coastal islands as well. And it can handle really, really harsh, tough environments.
Yeah, and it's very easy to grow, isn't it? Because you just got to put a pot plant underneath a Manuka tree, and it'll start getting seeds from the Manuka tree.
That's right. It produces seeds, and the seeds will stay in the soil and they stay there for a long time. I guess now we should probably let the cat out of the bag a little bit, and say where this plant originally came from. I call it the far lap story in reverse. And New Zealanders and Australians know all about far lap, this racehorse, which arguably was the most famous racehorse of all time. It was actually bred here in New Zealand, but then ended up making its fame in Australia. And the Australians always claimed it as their own.
Yeah.
Well, now we've got this plant that New Zealanders and of course the Maori were the first people to come to New Zealand. And when they got here, they found this plant and they named it Manuka. And all of us have always thought, oh, well, this is a New Zealand plant. Well, it turns out it's a bit like far lap. But in fact, this plant actually came from somewhere else originally, and it came from Australia.
Oh, really?
Came from Australia long, long time ago. Nobody knows exactly when it got here, but it was thousands and thousands of years ago. We know that the parent of the genus that Manuka is in, the Leptospermums, originated in Australia. It was there when Australia was actually quite a tropical area, a wet area, and then the big dry came and the desertification of Australia about 10 million years ago. This parent plant ended up in gullies and bits and places where it could still find enough moisture to survive, and finally created individual species. Okay, now there are 88 species of leptospermums in Australia now. One of those species is Leptospermum scoparium, and that's our Manuka. But no one knows how it, and as I was saying to you, as a result, we do have Leptospermum scoparium. Manuka, we call it, or they call it tea tree, and growing along the coastal fringes in east coast of Australia and also in Tasmania.
Yeah.
But somehow, some of those seeds from that plant managed to get over here to New Zealand, float over. Who knows how it really happened? But when it got here, it loved the place. It loved the place so much more than Australia, where it really has to seek out areas where there's sufficient, rainfall to be able to carry on. The one type of environment it doesn't do well in is a really desert area. But once it got here to New Zealand, it just loved the place.
Yeah, probably.
Of course, it also got a big helping hand in spreading around the country by the first people to come to New Zealand. New Zealand was the last large landmass ever occupied or discovered by man, and the Maori came here in about 1200 AD. And when there was Manuka growing, but most of New Zealand was with big climax native forest, not Manuka. The Maori, though, loved this bird, this giant bird that went coursing around New Zealand, the moa, and they hunted it out wherever they could. And in doing the hunting, they would create these big fires to try to flush it out. And those fires resulted in a very large amount of the New Zealand environment going through a significant change. The big forests disappeared because of the fire, and then the Manuka took over. And Maori, in their changing of the environment, opened up New Zealand for Manuka to grow much more extensively.
Yeah, true. I mean, and of course, New Zealand actually was part of Australia, wasn't it? Billions of years ago.
Well, yeah, but this we know that it was not a part of the Gondwana land change at all. That's many, many more millions of years before. We know that the parent leptospermum is about 10 million years old. Okay, so the parent of all these other species. So it was only after that 10 million years. Or that time 10 million years ago, when the environment in Australia changed considerably, that we started getting all these individual species of leptospermum. So Manuka itself had to get over here to New Zealand after that point.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Must have come on the sea or something, eh?
That's right. I mean, we're talking about very long term here, and in terms of environmental change and that. But that's what the records certainly show, and all the botanists are pretty clear about that these days.
Yeah. I wonder if they've tried growing it in Tasmania, because that's a very similar climate.
But yeah, no, it does grow in Tasmania.
Yeah. That's
the other place where it does really grow well.
Oh, okay.
And there's always some confusion, too, when you use the word tea tree. You use common names for plants. Unless that common name is fairly uncommon, you can be confused. And, there's tea tree oil, and they talk about tea tree in Australia a lot. There are actually several species, they're not even the same genus, that they call tea tree. One of them is Melaleuca, which is a totally different species in the leptospermums. The reason they call them tea tree is that when settlers first came to Australia, they actually used the leaves to make a brew, to make a tea to drink. Okay.
Yeah, I heard Captain Cook did that apparently.
Yeah, but they were able to do that with Manuka, with the Leptospermum scoparium, also with Melaleuca, and with a couple of other leptospermums. And one of them is called jellybush, which is very closely related to Manuka. So the Manuka, though, over here is just this one specific species, and it is found a little bit in Australia, and as we know, all over New Zealand.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you do find Manuka these days, or Leptospermum scoparium, in a lot of places in the world. We'll talk about that in the book, but not as a wild plant. It's been a fantastic plant for nurserymen to do selections and create beautiful flowering varieties. So it's a garden ornamental tree, and you can find it all over the world being grown as a ornamental tree or shrub.
Oh yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, and over Christmas time, it has beautiful white flowers, and then almost like it's snowing. We get that.
That's right. But one of the things that the nurserymen like about it is there's so much genetic variability in this species that it's not just white flowers. There's all kinds of other colors of flowers. There's bright red ones. There's pink ones.
Yeah.
And they can also go make changes when they find these mutations and back crosses and that, and they can make double flowering ones. So they look like almost little miniature roses on the plant. It's amazing, really. So, yeah, if you go to your local garden center, wherever in the world you might happen to be listening to this podcast, it's quite possible you'll find it actually being sold as an ornamental shrub.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have a really fantastic garden centre in Auckland called the Orotea Native Garden Centre. It's in Orotea, and they've got all different varieties. It's fantastic.
That's right. Yeah.
So, and you go there on a hot day, and you can see which ones the bees like. So,
in the book, I talk a little bit about the nurserymen and how they made all these name varieties, and I think there's over 200 different name varieties of Manuka that are being sold in nurseries around the world.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Mm.
And you don't keep any hives yourself there, Cliff?
There aren't any here at present. I certainly have kept hives in the past, and at one point I actually managed an outfit of 1,800 hives, but I haven't most recently. I always say to people when they say, "How come you don't have any hives?" I say, "Well, that's like asking a dairy advisor how come he doesn't have a cow in the backyard." You know, my work always over the years has been with commercial beekeepers, really, and the development of the commercial beekeeping industry. I certainly enjoy bees immensely and enjoy looking at them, and I certainly looked at thousands and thousands of hives in my career.
Yeah.
But I also don't want to be a bee haver.
Yeah. No.
If you know what I mean.
I
There's beekeepers
do know
and
what
there's
you mean,
bee
yeah.
havers, and I don't want to be someone who doesn't put enough work into his hives and ends up neglecting them. So, yeah, some of the things we've been doing recently, particularly traveling overseas and stuff, it doesn't really fit with having a couple beehives in your backyard.
No, absolutely. You've got to maintain them, especially over this swarming season.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And, keeping the varroa under control. There's a number of things that you have to do with your bees, otherwise, you're probably going to lose them. Yeah, I'm not
yes. I mean, we've touched on the American foulbrood before, and that's a big issue around Auckland. So, absolutely.
Yes, an American foulbrood. That was that writing that book was really a fantastic experience. The National Beekeepers Association here in New Zealand had to go through a process of changing its disease control process. Basically, they had to take over the control systems from the government. The government didn't really want to have much to do with it anymore, but they said you could do it using this legislation, so called a pest management strategy. So we had a fantastic American foulbrood control program here, one of the best in the world, and we have very, very low rates compared to most other places in the world. And we were using a system which was different from what you find in a lot of other places in the world. We were using a system that didn't use drugs, antibiotics, as a prophylaxis, as a treatment to prevent the disease. We were using a search and destroy and quarantine system, and it always really worked well for us. Yeah. So when we did the pest management strategy, one of the things that had to be done was we had to write a book for use by beekeepers explaining, best methods, if you will, of the New Zealand system. So we wrote that book, and it came time, I wrote it with Dr. Mark Goodwin, a fantastic beekeeping and pollination scientist from Ruakura and North Island here, Hamilton.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
We wrote the book, and came time to give it a title. And we thought, New Zealand AFB beekeeping book or something like that. And then we thought, no, we should actually really put the title exactly as it is. And that turned out to be Control American Foulbrood Without the Use of Drugs. Well, about 6 months after I think we wrote the book, they discovered a strain of American foulbrood, first in Argentina and then in the United States that was resistant to the antibiotics that they were feeding bees. I always thought it was amazing it took that long, actually, for American foulbrood that bacteria to develop the resistance, but finally it happened. And they had to actually rethink their programs in a number of places. And of course, there was our book sitting there, available, which explained the program we were using, and we were able to provide very, very good documented evidence based on the good reporting systems we have here for American foulbrood to show how we were able to keep American foulbrood under very, very good control, less than 0.1% of hives per year in New Zealand have it these days. And that was an amazing achievement, and there was a book that they could pick up to show how we could do it. So the book ended up selling really well overseas, and it was used in a number of places. One of the places I know that it was very, very helpful was Argentina, where they had a big American foulbrood outbreak because they had this antibiotic-resistant strain of American foulbrood, and they took our book and translated it into Spanish. And I was just over in Argentina visiting some beekeepers in May, and several places they are actually showed me a paraffin dipper that we use here in New Zealand to preserve our woodenware and treat our woodenware if we get an American foulbrood infection. And they showed me their paraffin dippers that they had, and they were exactly the same one as we had in the book. I actually just looked at the photo in the book and made one exactly the same.
Oh, it's fantastic.
So a bit of New Zealand beekeeping technology that's actually gone around the world.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, for a small country, we do invent a lot of things, don't we? Like,
we do.
Like electric fence is another thing which has gone around the world, and they use to protect against bears in America now.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Oh no, that book and the other one you're involved with, The Control of Varroa, are two books that I recommend every beekeeper in New Zealand has. They should. And
that the book on Varroa has sold really well as well, and it is in fact available on the internet. I think the New Zealand government put it into the Creative Commons, and you can, in fact, if you want, download a copy of it as a PDF. Now, with that book, what was interesting, of course, New Zealand was one of the last countries, beekeeping countries in the world to get Varroa. There had been a lot of research and a lot of work done. And so when we got it, what we wanted to be able to do was create a handbook that beekeepers could use. Something was really written for beekeepers themselves rather than for scientists and stuff. So taking all the information out there that was in science journals and as well the experiences that beekeepers had elsewhere in the world, and put it into a handbook that just any beekeeper really could pick up and have a read and find out really what the best practice was at that point in the world in terms of Varroa control. So that's how we went about writing that, and it seemed to really have an appeal overseas, because I think it was one of the first times all that was put into quite a compendium. There were some Varroa control was certainly in some books, and it would be chapters in other books, but this was one that really surveyed all the literature, both science and the practical thing at the time, and put it into as easy to use form as we could make it.
Yeah, no, it's a great book. I've read it several times. Yeah, we'll include a link to that free download as well, and that'll be in kiwimana.co.nz/Cliff for the show notes for this podcast. Yeah, so anyone overseas that wants to grab a copy, here, get one. So what do you think's the biggest issue facing beekeeping in New Zealand at the moment, Cliff?
Well, we've had spectacular success in increasing the number of hives in this country at a time when around the world, everyone's really worried about bees disappearing, and for very good reason. I spend the last chapter of the book talking about that.
Yeah.
The threats to bees by Varroa and neonicotinoids, and as well the low prices that beekeepers in some areas still get for their honey, which forces them to do some really, really hard work with their hives to try to make a living doing pollination and that sort of thing. Anybody who's read Beekeeper's Lament by Hannah Nordhaus will know all about how the really often very hard lives of commercial beekeepers are inextricably linked to the disappearing bees problem. In our situation, though, we have sort of done the opposite, haven't we? I mean, we've increased our hives in that period by now, it turns out, 66%. We've got 500,000 hives now after the last survey done just last year. And that's a remarkable achievement. And we've done it because we've been able to get really good prices for Manuka honey.
Yeah.
And also for the pollination that we're doing. And so beekeepers are able to make a really good living here in this country. And when you're making a good living and you've got the resources, you can overcome your losses. You still get increased losses from varroa and from all kinds of other things, but if there's a strong incentive there in terms of putting your work in to get some return out the other end, getting a good return and having a good life from it, beekeepers are fantastic at being able to overcome their losses, and that's what we've done here. So probably the biggest issue facing in New Zealand, I suppose, now would be for beekeepers to sustain that for the future. And I think we're in a good position in that regard. We need to have more young people come into commercial beekeeping, right? To take over from the older guys. Many of them, getting to the end of their careers. So we need to have a good succession program. But that's actually no different than in most places, where commercial beekeeping is carried out. Places like Canada and the United States.
Yeah.
We have a really good hobbyist sector here in New Zealand as well, and often that can be, as you say, a breeding ground really for getting people interested in bees and get young people interested to the point where they want to go work for a commercial beekeeper and then maybe, in fact, go commercial beekeeping on their own. So we're in an enviable position actually here in New Zealand, and we have a really vibrant commercial beekeeping sector.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think getting young people and kids involved in beekeeping is a really good stepping stone to more commercial beekeepers, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so you've done a lot of work overseas in other countries like the Solomon Islands and Argentina, which you touched on before. So what do you think is the biggest difference between beekeeping in New Zealand as opposed to other countries?
Well, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I was actually asked that by someone who doesn't know anything about beekeeping at all, but is one of our favorite radio interviewers here in New Zealand. 2 weeks ago, Catherine Ryan on the national radio, and what I said to her, and I really firmly believe this, is actually as I go around the world, I find that most beekeepers have quite similar problems, as it turns out. And of course, they all use the same sort of gear, the wonderful movable frame hive that was developed by Langstroth in the middle parts of the 1900s, which, as I say in my book, created a revolution in beekeeping and really allowed bees and beekeeping to be spread all around the world, all these places where bees had never been before. And now when I go overseas, I'm visiting some of those places where bees have come, more recently. Yeah. And the guys who are doing commercial beekeeping there, they're using the same frame, same boxes, size usually. They have the similar trucks, use the similar types of extractors, all that. So a lot of it's actually quite similar. The differences really only relate mostly to the floral species that they have, and then the environmental impacts of changes in land use and that sort of thing. And those always seem to be specific to the area that I visit. Okay. So you can deal with beekeepers and talk about problems that sort of beekeepers all have in common in the world, in a lot of respects, varroa control, extraction of honey, all these sorts of things. But the ones where you really have to get down to it for a specific country really relate to floral sources and also the impacts of change in the environment. I've just been in Uruguay, for instance, and that country. A very good beekeeping industry. They're seeing a lot of change because their pasture agricultural systems, quite similar to the ones we had here in New Zealand, are being changed over to soybean production. Okay, so they're basically pulling up the fences and taking the cows off of the paddocks and turning those paddocks into soybean fields. And there's a lot of use of insecticides to control pests in the soybeans. Well, it also knocks out the bees, and it's becoming more and more difficult to keep beehives on some of those areas where they once would have gotten great crops from pasture.
Yeah.
Now they've got these problems because of the field crops. So they end up having to move their hives and shift them to areas where they don't have the soybeans. So that's made changes for their beekeeping management systems.
Yeah, that's sad, isn't it? That the pesticides are probably affecting the bees like that.
Yeah, it is sad, but of course, once again, as I say, beekeepers, and particularly beekeepers who try to make a living from their bees, they're really resilient creatures.
Yeah.
They're as resilient as the creatures that they're keeping, and they can come up with interesting and innovative solutions to deal with those issues. So
yeah, exactly.
That's the other thing I always see. I'm always amazed and heartened, I suppose, by what I see beekeepers able to do with their hives, no matter where they happen to be in the world.
Well, I guess that's one of the good things that Langstroth gave us, that we can actually move bees easily, can't we?
That's right. It allows us to keep bees in a form where we can really look after them, and make sure that they don't get a disease, make sure that they're not starving. We'll feed them, replace their queens, easily make splits, do all of these things that allow us to actually keep a very large number of hives and maintain them really well. And at the same time, as you say, be able to take honeybees from their original areas, where they came from in nature, really, and to move them to all parts of the world. I think it's basically every continent apart from Antarctica has got honeybees on it now. And they've even got some beehives, and they're Langstroth hives for sure, in Greenland.
Yeah.
As I really spend quite a bit of time in the book talking about this age-old relationship that we have with bees. It goes way, way, way back, way before we even were settled in one place and invented writing and all that sort of thing. But we've maintained that relationship all the way through, and it's just as important now. Probably more important now in some respects than it even was back when we were climbing out of the trees, I suppose, or being hunters and gatherers. And the movable frame equipment, this discovery by Langstroth, really allowed us as humans to greatly increase the number of hives and the range of hives all around the world. Exactly. It really has been, in many respects, a golden age of beekeeping from when Langstroth developing that. And there's lots more hives and lots more places than there ever was before then.
Yeah, and it's amazing that people like Mary Bumby, spent 6 months on a boat and bringing 2 skips of bees over, wasn't it?
That's right. And if for your listeners, well, I say most New Zealanders wouldn't know who Mary Bumby is either, so I suppose we better tell them what that.
Yeah.
There were no honeybees in New Zealand before 1839.
No.
We have a number of solitary bee species. They don't collect honey, but they certainly work plants and particularly collect pollen and make little nests where they just provision the nest, put a bit of pollen in, lay an egg, and then the next year you get a bee coming out again. But no colony insects producing honey in New Zealand. Until 1839, missionaries coming, Wesleyan missionaries coming to New Zealand, and they brought with them to the far north of New Zealand, Hokianga Harbor. Maunu is the mission station there. And they brought the first bees. And the first beekeeper in New Zealand was a woman, and she had the most amazing name, really. If you were a novel writer and you went and put a name like this for a beekeeper, people wouldn't believe it, would they?
No, they wouldn't. No.
Yeah, Mary Bumby. I mean, that's just the most fantastic name for beekeepers. And she must have been a really good beekeeper, because she kept those 2 skips alive for that whole 6 months journey. Probably in a leaky boat, as the song goes.
Yeah, from the Split End song. She must have fed them, Must have fed them extensively.
Absolutely, yeah. And there is a very good book. It was quite a limited print run, but if you ever get a hold of it, by Peter Barrett about this. It's called The Immigrant Bees, and it talks about how bees were brought to both Australia and New Zealand And he really details the sort of things that they did. They definitely fed those skeps. And in some cases, when they were bringing bees, say, from the west coast of the U.S. and bring them, say, to Australia, and that the ship's captain would hole up in Honolulu and come in first thing in the morning and then not leave again until at night again, which allowed the bees to actually forage on the flowers in the harbor for the day before they left. So they had these interesting things that they did, and they certainly fed the bees. We also had a bee in there, which were the European black bees, which are very, very good at looking after themselves. And they ended up being the bush bee, if you will, or the feral or wild bee that we ended up getting in New Zealand. And as we know, the black bees here in New Zealand, you really don't have to look after them. They can look after themselves. So they were really the right bee for having in skeps for a 6-month voyage, because they could live on the smell and oily rag.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So when Mary showed up here, they got here in north in March of 1839, and the honey season was fully over by then. But the next spring, the spring of 1840, the honey flow the earliest in the country up there. And there would have been Manuka all over that area. We know for sure that was the case. And the very first honey then that was produced in New Zealand, ever by honeybees, would have been Manuka honey.
Fantastic.
And there's some suggestion that she may in fact have had honey to be able to put on the table at the very famous signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, which first started in Waitangi on the other side of that peninsula, but then several days later at their mission station on Hokianga, there were more Maori chiefs that signed the Treaty of Waitangi at that mission station, Mangunu, than there were at Waitangi itself. And it's quite possible, quite likely, I think, that she would have served honey to the guests. That's
right. That's probably why people signed the treaty, because they love the honey.
Well, I mean, it's quite, who knows, sweetened the deal. But, it would have been quite an amazing thing for everyone there to really have a taste of, because they wouldn't, in many cases, have experienced it. And there is a letter from a missionary family who came to visit Mary a bit earlier, and came to see the English bees, as it was called. And then after that, Mary loved children and certainly loved her bees as well. And we know that she sent a small package of comb honey to that family.
Yeah.
And the mother talks about giving it to her kids, and that would have been the first time her children who were born in New Zealand had ever tasted honey.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, the first honey that was being spread around there and being tasted was definitely Manuka honey.
Yeah, and fantastic. And for overseas people, the Treaty of Waitangi was the treaty between the native New Zealanders and the European people, which has been controversial over time, but that's good.
So beekeeping goes back, as far really as the history of New Zealand settlement.
Absolutely.
And it's quite reasonable to understand why bees were brought in so quickly, of course, because one thing that happened with European settlements is that they changed the environment of New Zealand, and they turned it into a pasture-based agriculture system with putting clover in to provide good food and fodder, protein for the animals that we're feeding. And of course,
and the fruits, I guess.
Part and parcel of having clover in your pastures is to actually have insects to pollinate the clover to set the seed, so that the clover is maintained in the pasture. So they understood that straight away. And again, in the book I mentioned several people were saying, that in the very first years they couldn't actually keep clover in the pasture, and they had to keep sending away to Britain to get more clover seed. But after honeybees became established here, there were actually lots of clover, and they were even able to produce clover seed themselves.
Oh, wow. And also up north there's a lot of fruit growers, isn't there? Like a lot of orange growers, so they would have needed bees for that too. Yeah,
oranges don't really need bees for pollination, but certainly get some really good honey from it. Yeah, but certainly other things like apples, for instance, and when the missionaries came and set up these mission stations, one of the first things they did was plant a garden, and they definitely had fruit trees there. And they had things like pears and apples, and yeah, in both of those cases, you definitely needed to have the bees do pollination. Of course, now in New Zealand, we have a very established pollination industry for our most famous New Zealand fruit crop, and that's kiwi fruit.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
But I hear the bees don't like it.
Bees don't like it. Well,
they get too many hairs on them.
Kiwi fruit is a very interesting plant, although there are all kinds of interesting plants and out there in agriculture. Kiwi fruit doesn't produce any nectar.
No.
So it's not the easiest thing to actually attract honeybees onto, because of course that's one of the two things that bees, need to sustain themselves. Well, they only have two foods that they eat, nectar, and they make honey out of that, and pollen. They don't collect or use any other foodstuffs. I do bring propolis in, but it's just those two food sources, right? And the thing about kiwi fruit is, well, you're cutting off half of the potential attraction because you don't have any nectar produced by the flowers. But it's peculiar as well because, in fact, both the male flowers, the male vines and their flowers have pollen, but so do the female flowers, okay? It's sterile pollen, but it's there nevertheless. So the way you get bees to be able to pollinate, to transfer pollen from the male flowers to the female flowers, is to create hives that have a high demand for pollen. And in fact, the bees don't know that the female pollen is sterile, so they go and collect that just as readily as they do collect the male pollen.
Yeah.
Okay, so, yeah, when you say bees don't like it, well, yeah, bees, they're not as attracted as they could be because there's no nectar. But Mark Goodwin has done pioneering research and worked out ways that we can put the hives into kiwi fruit, and we can do pollination and be very, very successful with it. Do that by creating an attraction for the bees to go out and try to gather as much pollen as they can.
Yeah, and I think that involves feeding the bees, doesn't it? Is it true?
That's exactly right. Yeah. You feed the bees early in the day, and you don't feed them a lot. You just give them a little bit, and it actually changes the foraging pattern in the hive. Basically, the bees think, oh, well, there's nectar coming in here. When we fly out, we don't maybe need to get so much nectar. We'll just go and get some pollen anyway because we've got all this brood, okay, and it's spring, and we're developing our colonies as quickly as we can, so they fly out and actually go and try to get pollen as well. And his work showed that he could increase pollen gathering by beehives and kiwi fruit by up to 400% by just feeding a little bit of sugar syrup to the hives each day.
Yeah, he's a clever guy, isn't he?
That's right. Amazing thing, that, and it works very, very well. So these days, I live right near Te Puke, the center of kiwi fruit growing for the country.
Yeah.
And these days, you don't just see beekeepers driving around at night with hives on the back of their trucks. You also see them driving around during the day, and what they've got is syrup tanks on the back of their trucks. So they're going to the orchards, and they're just feeding just small amounts, half a liter, no more than that, to the hives to get them to stimulate to collect kiwi fruit pollen.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, we're just going to have a bit of a contest now, Peter, because we thankfully Hannah from your publishing company gave us a free copy, so that's really thanks for that. Yeah, so we'll have a bit of a contest. So everyone out there, if you want a free copy of Cliff's book, which is a fantastic book, here is the question: who is the book dedicated to? And you'll get that answer from our previous discussion. So just send that to us at info@kiwimana.co.nz, and we will announce that the next show. And also, your publisher's very kindly given us a discount too. So if you go to the publisher's website and use the coupon code KiwiMana, we'll have all these details in the show notes, and that you can actually get, I think it's 15% off.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
So we'll and that contest is open to everyone in the world. We'll ship that out to you wherever you are.
That's great. Just a little bit about the book and where it's being published. It's been released at this point in New Zealand, of course, and Australia, and also in the UK. It's just coming out in the UK now. I believe it's on the bookshelves there, sort of right now or at the end of the month. It's definitely going to be there. And there are negotiations underway, and it looks like it'll be available through the other sources, normal sources, I suppose, in North America at the beginning of the year.
And it's on Amazon right now as well. You can get it from Amazon.
It is, yes.
Yeah.
If you go to Amazon UK, you'll be able to get it. If you go just to Amazon US, currently it says that the book is out of print. That's not exactly right, but it'll be there available once they get the distribution set up in the new year. But you can buy it as an ebook.
Yeah. Well, we'll have a link to that to the Amazon page as well. So, no, it's a really fantastic book, everyone out there. Yeah. So I really encourage you to have a listen, or not have a listen, have a read, I should say.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate, it's a book for everybody, really. It's
absolutely
try to tell a really neat story. It's really a rags to riches story. It's got some science, it's got some bees, it's got a number of things in it. But we tried to write it in a style that'll be interesting and entertaining. And I have to tell you, just to end, that earlier in the week, we had the official launch of the book in Auckland, and Peter Mullen came along and was the guest speaker for that, which was just a fantastic thing to do.
Oh, I didn't. I've known that ought to come along, Cliff. Sorry.
Yeah, that's right. It was a great night.
Yeah.
And we really did enjoy ourselves. And he said at the meeting he really enjoyed reading the book, and it felt wonderful when he said that. And I got to tell you, Peter knows more about the therapeutic properties of honey, and particularly Manuka honey, probably than anybody else on the planet. So for him to say he found it enjoyable and entertaining was just a wonderful feeling. I said at the time that, an author can't have any better feeling at all than to have the main character in his book say he liked it. Yeah,
absolutely. Oh no, it's a great book. I think it's not just for beekeepers, as you say. It's for anybody that likes honey or wants to read about the history of honey. And it's it's a great book. So get out there and grab a copy, guys, and take use of this coupon code. You can do a cheaper version of it. So that's fantastic. Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming along on, Cliff. It's been really fantastic talking to you, and I've really enjoyed our discussion. And,
likewise. Hello to all the beekeepers out there all around the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
To say hi to everybody on a podcast like this.
Yeah, exactly. Well, when you've probably got beekeeping friends all around the world, haven't you? Because of
I certainly do. Yeah, and a whole lot. Also, ones in South America.
Yeah, well, hopefully they'll all pick on this. We've got a few listeners over in South America, so tell everyone about it. So it's fantastic. Oh, well, thanks for coming, Cliff, and I really appreciate your book, and I appreciate your work you've done over the years. It's been really good, and thank you.
Okay, cheers, Jerry.
You stay on the line there. I'll just close the show. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and the show notes for this one, which will have details of that contest and that discount code, is kiwimana.co.nz/Cliff.